R-Type Final 2 is a bad name. That's not exactly what I want to talk to you about today, but it is something that got me thinking. In 2003, R-Type Final was released for the PlayStation 2, and it was meant to be R-Type's swan song. The shoot-'em-up genre had been slowly dying, and this game would officially bring the entire series to its epic conclusion. And, well, it did. For a while. Yeah, there was the tactical R-Type Command PSP game that was released a few years later, but let's be honest, that one was more of a spin-off and doesn't really count. Instead, fast forward 18 years to the release of R-Type Final 2, a sequel that secured funding through a Kickstarter campaign a few years prior and would be overseen by Final's original director. Look, I love R-Type and I love shoot-'em-ups. I would never turn down a new game in the series, but something about this whole situation just felt kind of strange and wrong. It was like taking someone who had lived a long, fulfilling life and had passed away gracefully with honor, then digging up their corpse and reanimating their body to try and have them recreate their best days all over again. R-Type Final 2 isn't a reboot, it isn't a remake, it isn't even a bad game, but it is the corpse of R-Type Final being pulled out of its coffin, given a terrible sequel title, and attempting to relive its glory days. It's a game that didn't need to be made. I'm not saying I'm upset it exists, but it did make me ask myself a specific question. Why can't we let a video game series just, well, end? Video games, just like most pieces of entertainment media, have been made over the years not only for the purpose of fun, but to bring in money and create profits. Generally, if a game is successful, its developer or publisher will want to make a string of sequels to grow its fanbase and capitalize on its popularity. This often leads to a successful series being stretched out and sometimes driven into the ground. It can even mean taking an idea meant to be a new IP and quickly slapping the title and assets of an already familiar and successful brand on it to increase its sales potential. Very few game publishers out there these days seem worried about keeping the integrity of their brands intact, and instead generally try to milk them until the well runs dry, though there are some exceptions like Nintendo and Rockstar. Game series like Earthworm Jim, Guitar Hero, Red Faction, and Myst all eventually burned out due to either degrading quality or market oversaturation. This was what made the aforementioned R-Type Final such a special game. Irem, the game's publisher, knew that things were not looking great for the franchise and its genre at the time, and rather than simply pull the plug or slowly release half-baked R-Type titles, they created one last big hurrah that was a celebration of the series' legacy and its grand finale. It was an anomaly in the video game industry, but a decision that demanded respect and left fans satisfied where the franchise concluded. Sadly, R-Type Final 2's inception somewhat cheapens the original's impact, especially by slapping an unimaginative 2 at the end of what was originally an epic title that emphasized the series' conclusion. Bringing a long-dormant series back isn't necessarily a bad thing though. Oftentimes, developers will simply reboot a game with a completely new vision that still pays homage to its prior titles. Games like Tomb Raider, Wolfenstein: The New Order, Mortal Kombat, and Doom all hit the reset button for their franchises and found a lot of success in doing so. They also reflected this reset by either using the series' original title or by adding a new subtitle. Rarely in these reboots is a subsequent number slapped on at the end. Going this route obviously doesn't always end in success though, with flops like Alone in the Dark, Turok, Bomberman Act Zero, Bionic Commando, and Golden Axe Beast Rider. But why can't we let a series go? Why can't it just stay in the past and be remembered for how great or revolutionary it was back then? Just because a series did great 10 to 20 years ago doesn't mean it will remain that way when it is released in a more modern gaming climate. Development teams dissolve, game creators get older, and people's expectations change over time. So why do we constantly want to see our favorite franchises always make a big return? The answer is nostalgia. The thing is, people find solace in things that are familiar. Let's take a look at the fan-favorite Contra series. It had a pretty regular release schedule of titles over the 2 decades following its 1987 inception. The games weren't all amazing, but Konami managed to keep the quality bar high enough for its fans to stay invested and the games to remain profitable. This release schedule culminated in 2011's Hardcore Uprising, a new Contra game that strangely ditched its titular name. It had gorgeous graphics, an incredible soundtrack, tight, challenging gameplay, and even a unique level-up mechanic to make the game a bit more accessible to newcomers without damaging the experience for veterans. To this day, it is still by far my favorite Contra game, and introduced enough fresh ideas to the tried and true gameplay to make it something unique and special for fans. Later on, at E3 2011, shortly after Hardcore Uprising's release, Konami teased a new Contra game with the iconic flaming C showing up at the end of their presentation and the text, "They're coming." The series looked like it was in a good place, so a new title seemed almost like a given. Then, silence. 8 years passed without a single mention of a new Contra from Konami, but fans continued to wait. In 2019, Konami eventually wheeled out the ugly husk of a game known as Contra Rogue Corps. It was a lifeless, poorly developed title that launched to zero applause and unanimous disappointment. Keep in mind, this was shortly after they had just released the Contra collection, which was a nice little surprise, but Rogue Corps was the brand new game that fans had been waiting for. Konami obviously knew it wasn't good, so why release it? Was it to make good on their announcement? Was it due to constant pressure from fans? Was it a blatant cash grab they thought they could sneak past everyone by slapping the Contra name on it? Honestly, it was probably a combination of all three, but there's no way to know for sure. The only thing we do know is that rather than let the series go out on a high note, they decided to force out a terrible sequel that no one wanted. Within less than a year though, fans had already gone back to praying and begging for a new title, even after Konami dumped an insult to the series into their laps and told them to shell out $40. And you know what? I was one of these fans. The most interesting part of this whole situation is that an indie game called Blazing Chrome was released just 2 months before Rogue Corps. It reviewed much better, captured the feel of classic Contra gameplay, and was the spiritual sequel fans had been clamoring for. So why then do we continue to ask for a new official Contra entry? The answer is obviously nostalgia. Many people have spent years in the Contra universe, playing as Bill and Lance, using the spread gun to kill hordes of enemies, rocking out to the catchy recurring music themes, and fighting the bosses that continue to make regular cameos. Is this a bad thing? Well, in my opinion, yes and no. I think craving nostalgia is just a part of human nature. It's just as natural to us as breathing, and is pretty harmless if you can recognize it for what it is. But it can also lead to some pretty illogical thoughts and behaviors. Now, let's look at the Castlevania series, which has an even stranger story. Koji Igarashi, the man who co-directed my favorite game of all time, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and was responsible for taking the franchise in a whole new direction, eventually got frustrated with how poorly Konami had been treating the series over the years, and left the company in 2014. Castlevania obviously continued on without Igarashi and the Lords of Shadow games, but never really made its way back to the classic side-scrolling genre fans were hungry for. Mirror of Fate was, I guess, kind of okay, and there was the short-lived Castlevania Grimoire of Souls, but I think we can all agree that one doesn't really count. After Igarashi's departure, he would go on to create a spiritual sequel to the more exploration-heavy Castlevania games he had made, titled Blodstained: Ritual of the Night. Most fans agreed that the game turned out pretty well and filled the hole that had been missing from the lack of 2D Castlevania games. Blodstained also expanded out into 2 retro-style games to satisfy fans looking for a more classic and traditional Castlevania experience. Still though, even with Igarashi setting out on his own to rectify Konami's misgivings, fans still continue to demand a new Castlevania game from a company that has continuously let both them and their beloved series down. Why can't we let the Castlevania series go and embrace the new Blodstained games instead? On paper, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, but nostalgia is a powerful beast that often defies logic. Even after a company completely mishandles an IP and drags its fans through the mud, they still keep standing back up and begging for more, hoping for a new entry that redeems the franchise and justifies their nostalgia. It's like comparing The Simpsons to a show like Seinfeld. Almost any Simpsons fan can agree that the show's quality and writing have steadily declined over the past 2 decades. Even to this day, the husk of a previously amazing show is repeatedly still trotted out weekly to keep the merchandise and licensing deals coming in. Seinfeld, on the other hand, called it quits during its 9th season at the peak of its popularity and is generally looked at more fondly overall as a complete series. It never received its Rogue Corps or Grimoire of Souls, and that ended up being for the best. So I'm not gonna lie, by this point this has pretty much turned into a Konami rant piece disguised as a well-composed video essay, and I apologize for that. Look, I'm not trying to sit here and tell you not to have nostalgia, or not to want your favorite game series to come back, because there's nothing wrong with that. What I am saying is that I think people should hold publishers more accountable for respecting the legacy of their series. At this point, I have almost zero hope that companies like Konami can ever return the mountain of game series we adore to their former glory days and meet fan expectations, at least not without some major outside help. Honestly, I'd rather have seen Contra go out with a bang in hardcore Uprising than trot it out and made a laughingstock with Rogue Corps. I'd rather people stopped begging for a new Castlevania and instead embraced Blodstained as its replacement. I'd rather R-Type Final 2 have been a series reboot with some fresh ideas and a title that didn't cheapen its predecessor. Nostalgia makes us sometimes think illogically and pushes publishers to sometimes keep a franchise going when it is honestly better off left as a comforting memory in the distant past. This is just my humble opinion though. What do you think?